Harvard gave me prestige, respect, and knowledge, but it never gave me peace. The truth is that behind every diagnosis and every academic title, there was an emptiness I tried to ignore. What I didn't know was that this emptiness would be exposed by a single question, hidden in a verse I never thought I would read. And it was that unexpected encounter with the Qur'an that began tearing down all the walls I had built inside myself. My name is Rebecca Martinez. I'm 52 years old and I'm from California. My life was always surrounded by hospitals, conferences, and laboratories. I believed intellect was the only key to understanding existence. And in a way, that mindset made me climb high steps. But it left me spiritually paralyzed. Everything changed when a verse from the Qur'an struck at the core of my deepest certainties. That reading opened a door I never knew existed. A door that took me from being a skeptical physician to a woman who discovered a far greater purpose than saving bodies. Saving her own soul. Before continuing with my conversion story, write in the comments where you're watching from. I want to know how far this testimony is reaching. Medicine taught me to look at the human body as a detailed map full of interconnected systems, chemical responses, and predictable reactions. I spent years perfecting the skill of dissecting, diagnosing, intervening. I knew exactly what happened when a cell failed, when a heart stopped, when a brain suffered irreparable damage. That knowledge gave me a sense of control, as if I held in my hands the key to life and death. It was that mastery that made me walk proudly through the halls of Harvard Medical School, proud of every degree and every achievement hanging on my office wall. People respected me. I was invited to conferences around the world, asked to write book chapters, and my name appeared in articles by colleagues I deeply admired. That visibility was like fuel. It fed my ego, giving me the impression that I had reached the peak of human achievement. But in the rare nights when silence surrounded me, when there were no patients to treat or papers to review, something stronger than recognition began to cry out inside me. It was a question I tried to silence, but it always returned with more force. Why do we exist? I knew how to explain how cellular respiration worked, how hormones regulated the body, how genetics determined our traits, but no microscope, no imaging exam, no biochemical equation answered what troubled my heart. And it was exactly that emptiness I tried to compensate for with more work, more research, more degrees. Deep down, I believed science was enough to sustain life. That was the banner I carried in classrooms and hospital corridors. I told myself that faith was just a crutch for the weak, a way to explain what reason hadn't yet reached. It was easy to keep that discourse in front of impressed students or colleagues who shared the same view. Harder was maintaining that pride when I was alone, staring at the ceiling of my room after saving a life in the operating room and still feeling a void that wouldn't go away. I convinced myself it was just exhaustion, that a good rest would fix it. But rest never fixed it. Public recognition applauded me, but in silence, no one applauded my soul. It was as if I had won countless academic battles, but lost something essential inside me. It was in that contrast between the strength of reason and the weakness of the heart that my journey began to change. I didn't know it yet, but all the pride that had placed me on such high pedestals would be confronted in a way even Harvard hadn't prepared me to face. And that confrontation wouldn't come from a laboratory, but from a simple page opened in a book I never imagined reading. I was used to dealing with tests, reports, and clinical protocols. My routine was as precise as clockwork. Diagnosis, prescriptions, results. It was in this predictable scenario that something completely out of the ordinary happened. Among so many patients who came and went from my office, there was a young woman who carried an unusual serenity. Even while battling a chronic illness that weakened her day by day, she didn't complain. She didn't play the victim. Her eyes conveyed a peace that I, even with all my academic background, couldn't understand. In one of the appointments, while reviewing her tests, she pulled a book out of her bag and placed it on the table. It wasn't a medical text. It had nothing to do with research or scientific advancements. It was the Qur'an. I remember her words as if they still echo in my office. Just read one page, doctor, and you will see that the medicine of the body is not enough without the medicine of the heart. I was unsettled. I didn't know whether to respond firmly, rejecting the suggestion, or to simply thank her politely and let the subject die. However, for some reason I couldn't explain at that moment, I accepted the gift. I took the book home without any clear intention. I placed it on my nightstand between research reports and medical articles. For days, I ignored its presence, almost as if I were afraid to open those pages. But there was something different about that patient's gesture. She hadn't tried to impose anything, hadn't tried to convince me, she just offered. That simplicity disarmed me. One sleepless night, after an exhausting day at the hospital, I reached out and opened the book at random. I came across a verse that said, "And we made from water every living thing." My eyes froze on the words. My scientific mind immediately connected them to the foundations of biology, to the origin of life that I had studied so many times at Harvard. I was paralyzed, asking myself, how could a text written in the 7th century contain a truth so aligned with what we now call science? I closed the book, took a deep breath, and tried to go back to sleep, but I couldn't. That single verse wouldn't leave me in peace. It was as if a door had been left slightly open, inviting me to look beyond the limits I had always imposed on my own mind. In the following days, I opened the Qur'an again out of curiosity. Each passage seemed to speak to me in an unexpected way, not only with the language of faith, but also with the logic my training valued. With each reading, something inside me began to stir, even though I tried to resist. I didn't know how to explain what was happening. But the truth is that that patient, with her calmness and silent faith, had started a process within me that no professor, no conference, and no hospital had ever been able to awaken. I, who so often thought I had mastered answers, now faced new questions, and I knew I couldn't ignore them for long. Reading that verse was like a spark that ignited something I didn't know existed within me. I spent the following days trying to ignore the impact, but I couldn't. During appointments, amid the noise of machines and case discussions with residents, my mind kept returning to that phrase. And we made from water every living thing. It was impossible not to think about it. The rational side of me tried to explain it away. Maybe it was just coincidence, a forced interpretation on my part. After all, ancient texts are full of metaphors, and I was simply reading with scientific eyes. But at the same time, something deeper was happening. I wasn't just reading those words. I was feeling them. And that feeling didn't fit within the Cartesian logic that had always guided my life. It was in that conflict that my internal struggle began. Part of me wanted to remain firm in the role of respected doctor, recognized academic, convinced skeptic. I told myself, don't get carried away. You have a reputation, a career, a life built on reason. You can't risk all of that for a religious book. But another part of me, quieter, more human, whispered, what if it's true? What if this book isn't just words, but a key to something you never dared to seek? During those weeks, insomnia became constant. I would get up in the middle of the night, turn on the dim light of the lamp, and leaf through the Qur'an, almost hiding from myself. I read in fragments, without order, without method, as if afraid to dive in completely. But each page held me in a way no scientific article ever had. I began to realize there were two worlds inside me. The first was the world everyone knew. The impeccable doctor, award-winning, proud of her trajectory. The second was the world no one saw. The restless woman full of unanswered questions who cried alone, feeling that all her rationality wasn't enough to fill the emptiness of her soul. I tried to hide this battle even from myself. At the hospital, I maintained my usual posture. At lectures, I spoke with the same firmness. But when I got home, I took off my coat, turned off my phone, and sat staring at that book on the table. It seemed to stare back, as if inviting me into a dialogue I didn't have the courage to accept. What scared me the most wasn't the content itself, but what it stirred in me. I, who had always believed nothing could shake my conviction, now found myself torn between continuing to be the doctor everyone admired, or making space for something that could completely change my life. And deep down, I knew this choice couldn't be postponed forever. The first readings left me unsettled. But I couldn't stop. Every time I opened the Qur'an, I found words that didn't just speak of religion, but pointed to something broader, something that touched dimensions of life I, as a doctor, had never learned to examine. Verses that spoke of justice, of mercy, of responsibility toward others. I was used to dealing with physical illnesses, but those pages made me see invisible ones. Pride, selfishness, indifference. The contrast between what I was reading and my own life was disturbing. I had always been proud of my reasoning skills, of the discipline with which I faced my studies at Harvard, of the confidence with which I spoke at conferences. Now suddenly, I felt vulnerable before a book written more than 1,000 years ago. Questions pursued me. Are you really going to allow a religious text to challenge everything you've built? The proudest part of me screamed, no. But there was another voice, silent, almost whispered, calling me to listen. I was curious. In the wards, amid voices, alarms, and hurried footsteps, I could maintain absolute focus. But at home, faced with silence, that same silence became an unbearable weight. It wasn't the absence of sound. It was as if that emptiness carried a message I couldn't decipher. Lying in bed, my mind full of doubts, the silence seemed to shout, what if the truth isn't where you've always looked for it? I began to realize that this struggle wasn't only intellectual. It was emotional, spiritual, existential. I tried to rationalize, but something was happening that escaped logic. I felt as if I were facing an invisible mirror that reflected not my appearance, but the essence of who I was. A woman who had accumulated diplomas, but had no peace. Who had saved so many lives, but didn't know how to save her own soul. This conflict grew more intense with every new reading. When I read about compassion, I remembered patients I had treated in a hurry without looking them in the eye. When I read about justice, I thought of how many times I had settled into privilege while others suffered. When I read about purpose, I remembered that no matter how many achievements I had, I still didn't know why I was here. The hardest part was admitting that those words were affecting me. I, the Harvard doctor, the rational professional, felt touched in a way even science never had. It was uncomfortable because it tore down the image I had built of myself. But at the same time it was irresistible. I didn't know where it would all lead, but I already understood that closing the book and pretending nothing was happening would be impossible. In that silence that shouted, my struggle was no longer against the text, but against myself. And deep down, I was beginning to realize that resisting that inner voice would only prolong an answer that sooner or later I would have to give. At first, I thought I could keep everything secret. My late-night readings, my notes hidden among medical books, my silent prayers that I still didn't know quite how to make. But nothing goes unnoticed in a competitive environment like Harvard. Observant colleagues began to notice small changes. Some saw that I spent more time alone. Others remarked that my stance in debates was no longer so harsh when the topic of religion came up. That was when a close colleague, someone with whom I had shared countless hours at conferences and in research, pulled me aside after a meeting. His tone wasn't critical but cautionary. "Rebecca, be careful. This kind of interest can ruin your reputation." I smiled as if brushing off an exaggerated concern, but inside those words echoed like a hammer. I, who had always defended academic freedom and the pursuit of knowledge without limits, now faced the paradox. Studying something sincerely could become a threat to everything I had built. That conversation was the beginning of growing tension. In classes, when a student brought up references to Islam, I noticed sideways glances from colleagues. In department meetings, certain comments arose, disguised as jokes, but heavy with judgment. I began to feel a different weight as I walked the corridors. I was no longer just the respected doctor. Now I was also the doctor who's been reading too much about religion. Deep down, the fear of losing everything haunted me. I had dedicated decades to earning credibility. And at Harvard that meant giving up a lot. Time with family, nights of rest, personal relationships. The idea of seeing all that sacrifice collapse because of a book was terrifying. But at the same time, I could no longer turn my mind off. It was as if two Rebeccas coexisted. The professional fighting to maintain an impeccable posture, and the woman who in silence was beginning to be captivated by something greater than titles. This contradiction was reflected in my actions. During lectures, I defended scientific advances with conviction, but avoided certain provocations against faith that I once made without hesitation. Some colleagues noticed this change in tone and began to question me either subtly or directly. I constantly asked myself, is it worth protecting the image and suffocating the truth that is beginning to be born inside me? With every warning, with every suspicious glance, my soul leaned more toward the answer I feared. Because deep down, I knew a flawless career would never be enough if behind it my essence remained shattered. And this conflict between reputation and conviction was only the beginning of a test I didn't yet fully understand. But that was already redefining the foundations of my life. If at work I was already facing suspicious looks, at home the situation became even more painful. When my family discovered my new interests, the reaction was immediate and intense. My mother, who had always been proud of her daughter from Harvard, respected in the community, cried as if she had received news of a death. She couldn't understand how I, after so much academic effort, could be paying attention to something she saw only as a risk to my reputation. My sister Elena was even harsher. With sharp words, she called me a traitor, accusing me of abandoning our family roots. She said I was going crazy, that the pressure of my career had made me lose my way. I tried to argue, to explain that it wasn't about abandoning who I was, but about seeking answers that had always unsettled me. Yet nothing I said seemed to make sense to them. It was in that tense environment that I experienced a loneliness I had never felt before. I, who had always been surrounded by students, colleagues, and patients, suddenly found myself isolated, even within my own home. Medicine continued to offer me status and stability, but my heart no longer found rest in degrees or rewards. The spiritual path, on the other hand, called with a force I could no longer ignore. On those lonely nights with no one to share my doubts, I found myself kneeling for the first time in many years. I didn't follow a specific ritual. I didn't use memorized words. I simply opened my mouth and let out a cry that seemed to come from the depths of my soul. God, if this is your way, guide me to it. It was a simple prayer, but filled with a sincerity I had never experienced before. After that moment, something inside me changed. It wasn't an immediate answer. There was no supernatural revelation before my eyes, but I felt relief, as if the weight of having to carry all the answers alone began to dissipate. It was as if I had taken the first real step toward a road I had until then only observed from afar. That prayer was the beginning of a new phase. From then on, I began to face every challenge. The criticism of colleagues, the disapproval of family, the inner doubts, as part of a refining process. I still didn't know where it would lead me, but I understood that if I had the courage to open myself before God, I would also have the strength to face whatever lay ahead. The price of discovery was high. Distance from loved ones, harsh judgments, and nights of tears. But in the silence of my first prayers, I realized there was something infinitely more valuable than the world's approval. The possibility of finally finding the truth I had sought for so long. After so many nights in silence, with only the Qur'an on the table, I felt I needed to see beyond the words. So, almost without planning, I discreetly visited a mosque in Cambridge. I entered cautiously, trying to go unnoticed, and sat in a corner to observe. What I saw marked me deeply. Men and women side by side in spirit, kneeling in absolute silence, prostrated before God. There was no pomp, no competition for titles or recognition, only surrender. It contrasted with everything I experienced in the academic environment. For the first time, I felt that reason and faith were not enemies, but companions on the same path. As I watched, a woman named Fatima approached and, without asking invasive questions, simply smiled and offered me a better seat. That simple gesture touched me more than any speech. There was no pressure, no judgment, only acceptance. I left there different. I wasn't Muslim yet, but I understood that I had crossed an invisible line. The first step had been taken. Faith was no longer just an object of study, but an experience quietly transforming my heart. I knew, even without admitting it out loud, that there was no turning back. The weeks following my first visit to the mosque were intense. I returned several times, always discreetly, seeking to learn more. Between one surgery and another, between exhausting shifts, my heart no longer found rest in academic achievements. It was as if each page of the Qur'an, each simple gesture of prayer I observed, pulled me toward a path I could no longer ignore. I began to study with even more seriousness. I read commentaries, sought guidance from scholars, spoke quietly with women from the community. At night when the city slept, I stayed awake reflecting, crying in silence, asking myself if I would have the courage to take such a definitive step. The day came when there was no longer room for doubt. Inside the mosque, before a few witnesses, I declared with my lips what my heart had already accepted. La ilaha illa Allah wa Muhammad Rasul Allah. I bore witness that there is no deity but Allah and that Muhammad is his messenger. In that moment something indescribable happened. An immense weight lifted from my soul. I was no longer just the Harvard-trained doctor. I was Amina, reborn, surrendered, finally at peace with God and with myself. After embracing my new spiritual identity, I realized I couldn't keep to myself what had transformed my entire life. I spent days reflecting until I finally gathered the courage. I placed the camera in front of me, took a deep breath, and pressed the record button. My voice trembled, but my words were firm. I spoke about my journey from the years of skepticism to the nights when the Qur'an began to illuminate my mind and my heart. I confessed that in other times I had laughed at religious practices I didn't understand. And for that I asked forgiveness first from God and then from the people I once hurt with my arrogance. In that very same video, I publicly declared my faith in Islam. I spoke of the relief I found, the peace I finally felt, and the certainty that I had taken the most important step of my life. When I published it, I didn't expect such a reaction. Within a few hours, messages from all over the world began to arrive. People giving thanks, others deeply moved, some still in disbelief. And here I open my heart. If this story spoke to you, consider supporting this channel through the Super Thanks button. Your contribution helps us bring testimonies like mine to even more people who need to be reached. As I look back on my journey, I realize that no degree, no conference, and no professional achievement was able to fill the emptiness I carried. It took years of searching, doubts, and tears until a simple reading led me to rediscover what truly sustains life: faith. Medicine showed me the fragility of the human body. But it was the Qur'an that revealed to me the strength of the soul. That verse that once made me stop as I read, "And we made from water every living thing," continues to resonate within me as a reminder that science and spirituality do not have to walk apart. If this story touched your heart, share this video in groups and on social media. Perhaps the message that reached you today is exactly the answer someone else has also been waiting for.